Hey folks, welcome back. Chris in Central Pennsylvania. I want to talk about the South African media and South African politicians' obsession with race and with skin color. They talk about other groups, particularly minorities, claiming they're the ones running around using the term white genocide and complaining about how whites are treated so poorly. Well, it's the media and the politicians who are obsessed with this. And a perfect example of this is a story that came out on the 30th of March from the New York Times and then was picked up on by South African media and ran stories almost verbatim on the 31st of March. One that comes to mind very specifically is this story from the IOL. In which they obsess about race. Donald Trump plans to launch refugee centers in Pretoria for white Afrikaners. Before I get to race, let me talk about this. This New York Times story that came out on Sunday, the 30th, and then this follow-up story from the IOL and others have got people in South Africa in a panic for absolutely no reason whatsoever. First off, folks, the United States is not building refugee centers in South Africa. That's ludicrous. As I've predicted since February 7th and every day since then, talking online and doing my videos and talking to people and writing about this, I've said what's most likely to happen is that if there's a large number of people interested in this program, which there will be, and there are based on what we've seen, then the U.S. Embassy and the diplomatic mission there will have to find commercial office space. I even suggested Emperor's Palace in Kempton Park to process people near Johannesburg. They will have to find places to conduct interviews because there's no space at the embassy to do this in the consulate. And there's no space in our other consulates in Cape Town, in Joburg, and in Durban to handle all these people for interviews all day long, every day. So they're probably going to have to lease commercial office space. And that's exactly what's happening. They're not building refugee resettlement centers. That's ludicrous on the face of it. I mean, honestly, do you honestly think that the United States would be allowed to build a refugee center in a country where people are supposedly under threat and peril of their life? To house people? That's what they're implying. No one's being housed. No. This is in-country resettlement. You're simply going to be processed and interviewed, and they're going to check your background, and if you qualify, they'll make an offer to you, and then they're going to give you a date that you'll leave. That's how it works. Now, you're not going to be living in FEMA tents. You're not going to be living in a building on a cot somewhere because you've been entered in the program. That's ludicrous. But that's the impression a lot of South Africans have now, black, white, and brown, being misled by the media intentionally. So stop it. That's the first problem. Second problem is obsession with race. So the title already says for white Afrikaners. President Trump's 7 February 2025 executive order makes no mention of the word white. It makes no mention of the word farmer. Nowhere in the document is there. Now, on the 7th of February or 7th of March, the next month, he did do a Truth Social post in which he said Afrikaner farmers, but he never said white. So this presumption that it's going to be white Afrikaners, this is intentionally done by the media to racialize the issue, If by definition, and this is where the simple-minded come into play here, if by definition Afrikaner, which it is to many people in South Africa, is simply a white Afrikaans-speaking farmer, well, your ignorance of what an Afrikaner is the first problem. Second, if that's your definition of an Afrikaner, them being white, then why do you need to include it? If by definition in your mind, which it is for many in the media and the politicians, an Afrikaner can only be a white person, then why do you mention the term white? That's just ludicrous. There's no need. That's superfluous. So they do it to skew the racial discussion and cause racial turmoil and tension. That's the purpose of it. So the title, White Afrikaners, not mention the executive order. And then it goes on. This is an article in the IOL on the 31st by Kamelcho Mochela. And so he says in the title, then he says, United States President Donald Trump has mobilized multiple teams to convert commercial office space in Pretoria into an emergency refugee centers for thousands of white Afrikaners. Never mind, the English is incorrect. It's not an emergency refugee centers. It's emergency refugee centers. So you can't use the definite article and indefinite article. You got to get it straight. Anyway, this came from a New York Times article, and it's very misleading. Setting up refugee centers in the very place where people are supposedly fleeing from doesn't pass a common sense test, folks. The U.S. is not going to be able to intrude in the sovereignty of South Africa by establishing refugee camps in commercial office space in South Africa. That just doesn't pass common sense. So stop falling for the nonsense that's being pushed your way. Then it continues. According to a recent report from the New York Times, the Trump administration is spearheading an initiative dubbed Mission South Africa, aimed at relocating white Afrikaners who claim to be facing challenges in South Africa. Again, there's no mention of white anywhere. And if your definition of Afrikaner is a white person who speaks Afrikaans, well, then what's the point of saying white? You get it? You get it, folks? All right. Here's another one. Where certain members of the white Afrikaner minority have initiated a campaign claiming to be the true victims in the post-apartheid era. That's verbatim from the New York Times article. And once again, white Afrikaner. Afrikaners are by definition white, are they not? Not in my book, but in the book of these people. And then Trump said several reasons, including the recently signed Expropriation Act by President Cyril Ramaphosa as an attack on the white minority, particularly farmers. Again, No discussion of that. So this is just very disingenuous and dishonest. It falls right in line with the nonsense that the media and politicians constantly push about white genocide. And unfortunately, Elon Musk has weighed on this issue, and he uses the term white genocide, which is not helpful. What's happening in South Africa does not meet the definition of genocide internationally, just like what's happening in Gaza doesn't meet the definition of genocide legally. This is not helpful. It's counterproductive to use these terms. What is happening is that there's clear racial discrimination of minorities, especially whites, but also Indians and coloreds, and even some blacks who affiliate with those communities. And it's unfortunate. The South African government sent representatives to the States to talk to our officials here this past week. I don't know who they really talked to. Daily Maverick claims they talked to a bunch of people, but they don't offer any evidence. So I just throw that back at you because that's what they did with AfriForum and Solidarity. Said they didn't really talk to anybody, just took a photo op. Anyway, they claim they talked to the White House, but didn't give any names, didn't tell us when or what they discussed. The bottom line with all of this, folks, is that the term is tossed about primarily by the media and by politicians who are seeking to distort the argument. Why? Because they're race baiting. That's what it's all about. That's what they're doing and that's what they're doing, and that's what's going on here. So the same thing here in this news article. White, 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 white. Okay, my definition of Afrikaner includes more than white people, but the media doesn't see it that way normally. So why are they putting white in there? Simply to corrupt the argument and mislead people. So this is unfortunate, but this is what happens in South Africa. The world must know. The world must know. But it's not just South Africa. The same thing happens here in the States, where people use these terms and then attribute it to their enemies, claiming they're the ones using them, when in fact those people aren't using them. Shame on them. Shame on them. So this story, nonsense. There won't be refugee centers where people be relocating in South Africa. It's just not. It's common sense. It's not. It's nonsensical. It's comical to even consider it. But people have been panicked because the media report that, and you read the media and people don't engage their brains to ask basic questions. Wait a second. Would the South Africans even let the Americans have refugee camps here where people can stay? Of course they wouldn't. Why would they do that? They're trying to rubbish the whole concept of people even leaving South Africa. Why would they facilitate your ability to get out of the country? It doesn't make any sense. Anyway, folks, thanks for listening. Be sure to leave a comment behind. And, when people make these comments about race, look where it's coming from. The media and politicians. They're the instigators. There are outliers, but they're very seldom are they people of any influence or importance. Cheers.